Hello and welcome. You're watching Global Lens from the CNBC-TV18 Prime Ionic Wealth Studio with me, Parikshit Luthra. These are the top global headlines we're tracking. Apple's global smartphone shipments could outpace Samsung for the first time in 14 years. Counterpoint Research says the positive response to the iPhone 17 series is a major catalyst. At least 55 people are dead and hundreds missing after an apartment complex in Hong Kong goes up in flames. The blaze tears through 7 of the 8 tower blocks. 3 construction company executives arrested so far. 2 U.S. soldiers shot and critically wounded near the White House after an attack by a lone gunman rattles Washington. Officials identify the suspect as an Afghan national who is currently in custody. U.S. stops processing immigration requests from Afghanistan after the attack. Our top focus this evening: uncertainty persists over whether Russia and Ukraine will have a peace deal soon. This follows a refined peace framework drafted by Washington and Kyiv after weekend talks in Geneva. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said he will discuss disputed points with the U.S. President Donald Trump, with European allies at the table. European allies fear the Trump administration may pressure Ukraine into accepting a deal favoring Moscow. As per reports, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told European leaders that Washington wants a peace deal before offering any security guarantees to Ukraine, something that Ukraine insists is central to any deal. Separate reports indicate that U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll issued a strong warning to Ukrainian officials that Kyiv will face an imminent defeat against Russian forces and therefore should negotiate a peace deal soon. In a high-level meeting last week, U.S. officials also said they cannot keep supplying air defense systems at the speed Ukraine requires. A U.S. team is expected in Moscow next week to present the latest version of the Trump-backed plan. Now revised with Ukrainian inputs and reportedly trimmed from 28 points to 19. On the ground, the war continues to rage on. Ukraine claims Russia launched 41 airstrikes, dropping over 100 guided bombs nationwide. Kyiv also struck a Russian plant involved in missile and drone production, along with several other military positions. Joining us now to discuss what's next in the Ukraine-Russia conflict is former Indian ambassador to the Russian Federation, Pankaj Saran. Ambassador Saran, 27th of November, Thanksgiving, was supposed to be the deadline for the Ukraine peace plan. Clearly, there is no deal and things are likely to spill over. Are you expecting some sort of agreement in the near term?
Thank you, Parikshit, for having me. I think there is a lot of activity going on. It is quite evident, diplomatic, behind the scenes. And it all began before actually the Anchorage summit in Alaska. So in between, the process somehow got derailed, put on the back burner, but it's been revived in the last few weeks. And there is a lot going on, it appears, behind the scenes. And all that we are getting to see is from the presidential tweets and leaks in the media from all sides. In fact, it's very difficult, the issues, but if you look at what's coming out of the public, it's quite clear that seems to be some newfound determination. There's a lot of silence from the Russian side, also interesting. A lot of to and fro between Ukraine and the United States. The Europeans are also making public statements. So I think we seem to be on the verge of some big development, I would say that.
All right. I would also like to ask you about the pressure that the United States is putting on Ukraine to come to a conclusion. A top U.S. Army secretary has apparently conveyed to Ukraine officials that a defeat is imminent on the battlefield and U.S. also cannot keep supplying arms to Ukraine. This also comes at a time when the Ukrainian president has said that they will step up expenditure on air defense manufacturing. What does this indicate, and do you think this will pressurize Zelenskyy into accepting the deal?
Yeah, I think what the American Army Secretary is saying is also what I've read. And I think there is enormous pressure on Ukraine. Again, what is coming out of the public and perhaps what is going on behind the scenes are two different things. I think President Zelenskyy is increasingly realizing that he has to come to terms with a U.S. determination to end the war and to define some kind of a ceasefire. So the bravado which we saw from Ukraine till last year or even early this year is no longer there. And I'm not sure whether the question of supplying additional weaponry or platforms or kind of beefing up the Ukrainian military capability as of today is actually on the table. In fact, the conversation is quite the opposite, that we have given you whatever we could. The time has come for you to take a step back, to be realistic, and to see how we can wind this whole thing down. It's no coincidence that this sentiment is being expressed by the US president repeatedly, almost every second, third day. And clearly, President Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians at a moment of truth in this war. And I'm not sure whether they have many options, actually.
Right. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff will be meeting President Putin next week with this new peace formula, which has modifications and suggestions from the Ukrainians. Do you expect the Russians to show some movement? Because the Russian president's spokesperson has said it's too premature to say a deal is imminent.
Look, I have been maintaining that as far as the Russians are concerned, this is their best chance at peace. I mean, the stakes are really very high because the Russians know that the Americans are battling the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and if the Russians want to move forward on this, they also have to make concessions and they have to step back a little bit. So I think, yes, the Russians will have to step back from their maximalist demands. But, there are two, three big issues out here. I mean, one is the territorial issue. The second is the security guarantees issue. And the third, of course, is what happens after the ceasefire so as to enforce the peace deal or the ceasefire. And on all of these, I think there's been already a lot of discussion between the Americans and the Russians. It's now a question of posturing, and that's basically where we are today. On the territorial question, I think the Ukrainians will have to concede, but it does not mean conceding territory does not mean international recognition of a new line of control or a new line between Russia and Ukraine. That's a separate issue. On the security guarantees, there is a huge spectrum available to both sides, starting from, for example, the size of the Ukraine army to its membership of NATO, association with the European Union, what the role of the coalition of the willing will be, whether the Europeans will have the right to have a military presence in Ukraine. From the Russian side, what kind of guarantees will they offer Ukraine that this will not happen again? And I think all of these issues are in an advanced stage of discussion because the stakes are so high and it's now being discussed at literally the summit level, failure could be very expensive.
Ambassador Saran, today is the 27th of November, which was the deadline for these negotiations to end and probably see a peace deal. But we are seeing very fierce battles in different parts of Ukraine and strategic towns. In fact, Ukraine government has itself said that there have been 216 combat clashes and fierce battles in 4 to 5 locations. Does this indicate that Russia is going to step up the battle, step up and escalate the conflict if the deal is not agreed upon and if they don't get the kind of concessions and territory they're wanting?
Look, that'll be gambling with a lot of things. If Russia were to do all of this, as you're saying, I mean, if they escalate the fighting, it's going to have a very big impact. We've actually gone through till a few months ago statements where President Trump said he's fed up of the Russians, he's through with this, it's very difficult, and he's been fairly critical of President Putin. Yet, in the last few weeks, his tone has changed. So, Now, whether this is the last flicker of the candle before, the whole thing dies out, who knows? But yes, on the battlefield, there is escalation in violence, there are attacks. But the most interesting thing is that this has not stopped the two sides from talking. And, the talks are not at usual official diplomatic levels. I mean, these are talks between two of the most empowered people on both sides, Steve Witkoff and the Russians, Ushakov and the others. So there is a lot of seriousness in this, and I would not dismiss the prospects of a breakthrough just because of what we are seeing on the battlefield. Both are, in fact, a reality. I mean, that's the whole irony of this whole situation, where it's so unorthodox, both the fighting and the talking, and both are going on at the same time. And in the talking, it's not the traditional foreign officers and the diplomats who are doing it. It's being done out of literally the State Department, although it's there involved, but uh, it's people like Steve Witkoff and the others who are driving this peace plan and negotiating it with the Ukrainians, with the Europeans, with the Russians. So I heard President Trump yesterday. He was saying, look, it's a very difficult task. I mean, because the US negotiators have to negotiate with three parties, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Russians. And the Russians also have to negotiate with the Americans, obviously. But the Americans, require that whatever Russia is offering is also acceptable to the Ukrainians and to a great extent the Europeans. The Europeans are feeling very nervous about the impact of the precedent-setting quality and what it means for the architecture, the security architecture in Europe, because here fundamental principles from their point of view are involved, which is respect for international law, territorial integrity, sovereignty, as we understand it in the classical sense. This peace deal is going to challenge all of the classical understanding of these principles, which had been enshrined after the Second World War in the United Nations.
Yeah.
So that is, I think, where we are.
Right. Sir, I would also like to ask you that when it comes to these negotiations, it's truly a transatlantic negotiation that we're seeing at this moment. If the US stops supporting Ukraine, will Europe do the same? And can Europe continue supporting Ukraine against Russia? Can they really afford to do so?
So one is the question of can they, and the other is the question of, one is the question of the will, and the other is the question of capacity. What we are finding is that, and Europe itself is deeply divided on these two questions of should we and can we. So on the can we, it's easier. On the should we, it's easier because they are saying, this is a question of European survival, European security, so therefore we must. But even there, on that question, there are divisions, let's say, between the Baltics, Poland, Germany, France, Spain, Hungary, and so on. How much should we go out to support? And that also is a reflection of the political forces that are dominant in these countries, because a lot of them, the far right and the right wing forces, are being more assertive, and they actually want a much more conciliatory approach to Russia than the others. So that's on the first. On the second is whether they can. Their European capacities are limited both financially and militarily.
Right. I would also like to ask you about India. We have been at the receiving end of US sanctions. India has almost stopped buying Russian oil directly because of the sanctions. Our relationship with Russia is also coming under strain. We've got the Russian president coming in December. Could you give us a sense of how the India-US trade deal will move forward here onwards? Do you think it's also connected to the Russia-Ukraine peace deal as well? India has done a great extent what US wanted vis-a-vis Russia. So do you expect some sort of movement on the trade deal if there is a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I hope so, because the linkage between the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Indo-US trade deal was not a linkage that India established. This was a linkage established by the United States. And this came as a great surprise to us. And the India-US trade deal was in a good place. I mean, from what I know, we had put in a fantastic package in the first few weeks of the Trump administration, and American negotiators were fairly satisfied with what India had to offer. It was a generous deal, perhaps unprecedented in its offers. We don't know the full details, but that's what I've heard. And then suddenly we find this linkage being drawn. So, you know, we've argued that this linkage is extraneous. I mean, when India was importing Russian oil was not under any kind of international sanction, whether American or European. So even if India were to argue that it does not, follow any sanctions except United Nations sanctions, uh, in this case, we were also not violative of, even if we were to follow US sanctions or European sanctions, those didn't exist. So the idea that India should be penalized for importing Russian oil was something which was um, quite a surprise to the Indian side. So I'm hoping that if there is a Russia-Ukraine, or let's say a Russia-America uh, peace deal or an agreement which relates to Ukraine, but possibly also goes beyond Ukraine, which is also possible, then it could have and it should have a positive salutary effect on the India-US trade negotiations, which I think seem to have gone beyond just trade negotiations into the political realm.
Mr. Saran, thank you so much for joining us on the program, speaking about the possibility of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia and also the ripple effects on India. Let's slip into a short break on Global Lens. But up next, U.S. President Donald Trump and his policies have just given momentum to a more anarchic world today. As per the recent Dragonfly intelligence report, that's not all. It highlights how geopolitical risks are hurting not just India, but the rest of the world as well. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Global Lens. U.S. President Donald Trump and his policies have just given momentum to a more anarchic world today. According to Dragonfly intelligence, while the Trump factor is playing out, it is not limited to the United States alone, but reverberating across the world. As per the report, India is identified as one of the major regional powers seeking to increase its global standing amid geopolitical flux. The report sheds light on the India-Pakistan conflict, which was triggered by an attack on Indian soil. It also highlights how after its brief 2025 conflict with Pakistan, India began expanding its space-based surveillance capacity. It plans to launch over 50 dedicated defense satellites by 2030 to monitor borders and the Indian Ocean region. However, the report says India is part of a group of nations that are raising defense budgets and upgrading capabilities, anticipating short-duration conflicts. The risk of rising conflict is hurting most nations. It is feared that there will be a potential for contagion, political crisis, sudden policy changes and supply chain disruptions. I spoke to Barbara Kelemen, Asia head at Dragonfly, earlier to understand the risks in supply chains and other risks that the world may face in 2026.
Yes, as you mentioned, supply chains and the vulnerability around that has dominated the discourse over the past year or so as a main focal point, really, between U.S.-China relationship. In fact, I think that's because it's one of the main vulnerabilities that currently exist when it comes to the two powers. And we just recently saw some restrictions around this being suspended. There is now a 1-year suspension when it comes to rare earths and some of the export controls. And although this points to some stabilization, which we also saw during the call this week, this is likely to be only temporary. In fact, what the two sides are probably going to do is to drive their policy more towards developing their own capacity and working around these vulnerabilities. So although there is going to be this temporary reprieve for the time being, the supply chains will continue to dominate discourse when it comes to operational capacity and risks for businesses going forward. Now, in terms of some of the main vulnerabilities, already mentioned rare earths are really at the heart of the issue, especially if we're looking at places such as US, Europe, but really globally. And then on the other side, there are other resources used for development of batteries, but also chips on the side of the U.S. especially. Now, I think another issue to mention would be the case of Nexperia, which was a Dutch company where the restrictions implemented early this year led to widespread shortages for car makers and suppliers across Europe. And I think that this is a good case which demonstrates how this one small vulnerability really affected the whole sector in the region and will probably lead to the bloc reassessing similar vulnerabilities in other areas and how to try to prevent similar disruption going forward.
What are the risks to India in 2026 in terms of geopolitics?
Yeah, so I think, again, going back to what I just mentioned, this U.S.-China struggle and competition, I think that the main risk there is really reshoring when it comes to some of the industries and supply chains and moving to other parts of the world, but also, either side trying to use India to either follow certain policy or act in a way that would align it more closely either with U.S. or China. Now, I would also mention another issue that we have mentioned in our strategic outlook for next year that we've identified for businesses in terms of disruption would be also renewed escalation with Pakistan, and especially after what we've seen earlier this year. There is a potential for this scenario to play out again, which is something that would again result for operational disruption for businesses and lead to potential tit-for-tat exchanges.
Which countries could step up use of AI for warfare, and what is the biggest threat as a result of adversarial use of artificial intelligence?
So already throughout this year, we have seen a number of state-backed actors using or exploiting the AI technology on some level. Now, it's a little bit of a more complicated discussion because it also involves other cyber threat actors, and it's in a way expanding the playing field for a lot of hostile actors. There are several reasons why that is the case, and it does lower the barriers of entry and really enables states to deploy more resources to develop such capabilities. We've seen already China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea state-backed actors to use these techniques and really expanding operations. Another issue is the AI really enables accelerated development of malware and expand targeting, and also really adds credibility to social engineering attacks that are becoming more common. In fact, one of the recent studies have suggested that already more than half of ransomware attacks that have occurred between 2023 and 2024 used AI-driven technology, and I think this is likely to be a trend going forward. And also another potential issue emerging is states leveraging AI to boost either state repression or broader tightening controls, either around specific areas in the digital space or targeting specific sectors as well.
Right. Do you see peace returning to the Middle East, or could there be potential of another conflict?
So in 2026, we assess that we'll see some form of stabilization, especially if we compare this to past few years. But a comprehensive peace remains an unlikely scenario. Israel's military activity will continue to shape the strategic outlook for the whole region. And this is because despite military risks easing in recent months, the strike that we saw across multiple countries in 2025, including Qatar and Iran, has really shifted security dynamics and eroded trust between Israel and Gulf states. And this recalibration will persist going forward and really constrain diplomatic coordination. Now, domestically, Israel's far-right coalition will probably limit its ability to really translate the military gains into lasting political outcome. So, although we have a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, this is likely to remain very fragile, as the key questions underlying this really, which is the future of governance of Gaza, but also disarmament of the group, are still unresolved. Meanwhile, it seems that Israel will very likely to expand its military operations in the West Bank and drive more settlements to effectively rule out the possibility of a future Palestinian state there. Now, another flashpoint that we are also monitoring is Israel's renewed confrontation with Iran. The June 2025 conflict has degraded Tehran's nuclear and missile capabilities, but it left the regime intact and determined to rebuild. And as a result, this means that Israel will probably remain intent on diminishing Iranian capabilities through additional strikes in 2026, leading to Iranian retaliations and days-long exchanges of airstrikes, similar to what we saw earlier this year.
My final question would be, could there be a potential point of tension between China and India? Both sides are competitors. We are adversaries, but we are also trying to normalize the relationship this year.
Yes, as you rightly point out, the relationship is complex, and there has been, in fact, a reset in 2025, which will probably continue into the next year, limiting a risk of any limited military conflict over the border issues that persist between the two sides. In fact, we have seen confidence building measures and some improvement in trade relationship. But I think that, again, the wider rapprochement between the two sides will probably prove elusive, and there will be a very delicate balance for both sides to try to play to both economic ties, but also ongoing, burgeoning relationship with the U.S. and persistent lack of trust when it comes to India and China on some of the military issues.
On final cut this evening, at least 65 people have died and dozens have been injured in Hong Kong after a massive fire engulfed an apartment complex yesterday. Hundreds remain unaccounted for. Officials say bamboo scaffolding and foam materials used during maintenance work may have fueled the fire's rapid spread. The blaze ripped through 7 of the complex's 8 towers before being brought under control. Authorities say this is Hong Kong's deadliest fire in decades. A task force has been formed to investigate, and 3 men from the construction company, including 2 directors and an engineering consultant, have been arrested. That's all for today on Global Lens. Goodbye and many thanks for watching.